All right, let's get back on the agenda here, get you guys out on a Friday. We have to start with our state reserve fund budget analysis, our analyst, Jason Kramer. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jason Kramer, and I'm with the Department of Legislative Services, and I'll be presenting the analysis for the State Reserve Fund. As you can see here on the cover page, the fiscal 2025 allowance decreases by $1.1 billion to just under $310 million. This amount reflects proposed actions in the BRFA to repeal the requirement for fiscal 2025 only for the provisions requiring appropriations of the unappropriated fiscal 2023 surplus. The reduction contingent on the BRFA is $495 million to the rainy day fund, as well as $25 million each to the pension system and post-employment health benefits trust fund. DLS is recommending directly taking those reductions and deleting the language, making the cuts contingent on legislation. You'll also notice that there is $90 million in special funds included in the fiscal 2025 allowance. This represents an appropriation to the dedicated purpose account of funds transferred from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. And I'll discuss that a little bit more later. The large fiscal 2023 amount included $2.4 billion to the rainy day fund and $1.8 billion to the dedicated purpose account. I'll discuss some of that dedicated purpose account funding later in this analysis. On page 2, the governor's plan includes 2 deficiency appropriations. The first is $30 million in the dedicated purpose account to assist with state center moving costs. That's in addition to $43 million remaining in the dedicated purpose account for this purpose from prior year appropriations. The budget also includes a $10 million deficiency appropriation to the catastrophic event account to guard against natural disasters or other catastrophes. The account currently has a $9.4 million balance after a $635,000 transfer to the Department of Labor in October of 2023 to be used to administer a loan fund for federal employees in the event of a federal government shutdown. Congress took action and federal appropriations did not lapse at that time. The historic balance of the catastrophic event account is $10 million. DLS recommends reducing the deficiency appropriation by $9.4 million, which would maintain a $10 million balance in the account. Exhibit 1 on page 4. While there is no planned appropriation to the rainy day fund, there are 2 planned actions to transfer funds from the rainy day fund, as shown here in Exhibit 1. The first would transfer $150 million to the general fund, which would then be used to fund a grant to WMATA via an appropriation in the dedicated purpose account. There's also a $96.4 million transfer to the general fund to reflect excess funding in the rainy day fund. As seen here, the fiscal 2025 anticipated balance is $2.34 billion. Exhibit 2 on page 5 shows that $2.3 billion represents 9.4% of estimated general fund revenues. That's higher than the SAC recommendation of at least 8.5% of general fund revenues. Exhibit 3 on page 6 shows the appropriations to the dedicated purpose account in the governor's budget plan. Some of these items you may recognize from prior appropriations to the DPA. There's $10 million in funding for End the Wait initiatives in Medicaid. That's in addition to $6 million provided in fiscal 2024. There's $3 million in funding for rebuilding state government initiatives in addition to $2 million from last year. Those funds were used to conduct a market study of state employee salaries and to conduct a workplace culture survey. The fiscal 2025 funding will be used to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the state workforce and develop plans to improve workplace culture. The fiscal 2025 allowance also includes $2.5 million for apprenticeship roles in state government. DBM is working with the Department of Labor and other state agencies to identify positions in state government with high vacancies that could have apprenticeship paths. This is in addition to $25 million appropriated in fiscal 2023 for apprenticeship programs at the Department of Labor. The mandated dedicated capital grant for WMATA that has in recent years been funded with general funds in the dedicated purpose account is instead funded with general obligation bonds. The fiscal 2025 instead includes a $150 million general fund appropriation that I mentioned earlier. On page 7, the dedicated purpose account also includes a few new or one-time appropriations. The largest is the $90 million that I mentioned earlier. It's a special fund appropriation using funds transferred from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, or SEIF, to implement the Climate Solutions Now Act and the state's climate pollution reduction plan. The BRFA includes a provision authorizing this use of funds. However, the budget bill does not include language making the appropriation contingent on that legislation, so DLS is recommending that language be added. To Exhibit 4 on page 8, this shows the proposed source of funds to be transferred from SEIF and the various account balances before and after the proposed transfer. DLS is recommending amending the BRFA to prevent funds from being transferred from the energy assistance account and direct that more of the funds come from the administration account within SEIF. On page 9, there are 3 capital projects included in the DPA allowance. These include a $30 million contribution toward construction of a public promenade at the Inner Harbor in Baltimore City. There's $7 million included for construction of a data science center on the Johns Hopkins Bayview campus. This is in addition to $13 million in GO bonds for this project. DBM has stated that both of these projects will be moved to the DGS budget in a future supplemental budget. $5 million is provided for state center demolition and planning. This is different than the $30 million in moving costs that I mentioned earlier. Finally, 2 new operating programs are being funded at in the dedicated purpose account at the Department of Juvenile Services. There's $7 million for the Enhanced Services Continuum Initiative and $5 million for the DJS Community Investment Initiative. There's more information on those projects in the DJS analysis. A couple of things that are typically funded in the dedicated purpose account are not funded there this year. The first is funding for food banks. That funding is instead provided in the DHS budget. And there is no cybersecurity funding provided in the allowance. A total of $362 million has been appropriated for this purpose in prior years. The governor is proposing transferring $149.5 million of that funding to the general fund, which would leave just under $100 million available in the account for this purpose. On page 1, the one key observation I'll discuss. On page 11, Exhibit 5, the dedicated purpose account retains about $1 billion in funds that have been appropriated between fiscal 22 and 24. This is atypical for the account. While funds may remain for up to 4 years beyond the close of the appropriation year, the fund balance has exceeded $100 million only once since 2000 prior to fiscal 2023. The reason for this is due to significant surpluses seen in recent years resulting from large amounts of that results in large amounts of funding being provided for specified purposes. Additionally, in fiscal 2023, the account was an avenue for the governor to provide funding for agreed upon legislative priorities. To Exhibit 5 at the bottom of page 11 and then continuing on to page 12, this shows all of the funds that remain in the dedicated purpose account. Many of these are for long-term purposes or projects such as blueprint funds, transportation funding for matching federal dollars, cybersecurity funding that I mentioned, state center relocation costs. In addition, there's $90 million for state agency facilities renewal, which includes $25 million for DNR critical maintenance projects. Of this funding, the BRFA includes a provision to transfer $44 million of it out of the dedicated purpose account that had been dedicated for, or that had been intended for PAYGO capital projects. Those projects were the 2100 Guilford Avenue building in Baltimore, the Maryland Department of Emergency Management headquarters at Camp Frederd, and Conowingo Dam dredging. After these proposed transfers, $48 million would remain for PAYGO capital. Finally, agencies reverted $18.7 million to the dedicated purpose account at the close of fiscal 2023. This includes $7.3 million for assisted living facilities and $4.5 million for the LEAP program at MSDE. DLS is recommending BRFA actions to transfer those funds, as well as 2 smaller allocations to the general fund. The assisted living funds were one-time COVID aid, and the LEAP program has ended. DLS is also asking DBM to comment on the usage of the remainder of the dedicated purpose account funds and whether they'll be retransferred to agencies for their original uses or if they could be transferred to the general fund. And then finally, a summary of our recommended actions beginning on page 14. Items 1 through 7 are the direct reductions I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, as well as the deletion of the contingent language that would no longer be necessary. Item 8 on page 15 is the language that would be added, making the transfer of SEIF funds contingent on the BRFA. And item 9 is the reduction of the deficiency appropriation to the catastrophic event account. And then finally, on page 16 are our two BRFA recommendations. The first would restrict the account that the CEF funds could be transferred from, and the second would transfer unused dedicated purpose account funds to the general fund. With that, I finished my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks for the great presentation and analysis as always. Are there questions for our analysts? Okay, Madam Secretary. Great to see you, Mr. Nicole. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Helene Grady, Secretary of Budget and Management, and Mark Nicole, Deputy Secretary, is with me. The administration appreciates the thorough analysis put forward by Mr. Kramer from the DLS. We have submitted written testimony, and we are happy to recap here our responses to the DLS recommendations. The first recommendation I'm going to speak to, and then Mark will help us with some of the others. The first recommendation on page 3, the DLS recommends reducing the deficiency appropriation by $9.4 million to reflect recent federal budget actions and maintain the catastrophic event account balance at $10 million. Our understanding of the threat of federal government shutdown, it continues to be real and not likely to be going away anytime soon. Our understanding is as soon as March, we may be back in potential shutdown mode. As long as there's an expectation of the administration standing up the Employee Assistance Loan Fund upon the next government shutdown, our position is that the $9.5 million planned for that loan program should remain allocated. Keeping the minimum $10 million additional operating appropriation authority in place in the catastrophic event account is very important to the administration's ability to respond to natural disasters or other emergencies, even while still being able to stand up that employee loan fund as soon as the next shutdown occurs. The proposed reduction would greatly diminish the state's ability to respond to unanticipated emergencies. Recommendation number 2 on page 3 and number 3 on page 8, DBM concurs with both recommendations. And Mark is going to speak to recommendation number 4 on page 12.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. DBM agrees with the first part of the DLS recommendation about reverting balances for nursing homes, hospitals, and assisted living facilities. DBM is currently working with MSDE to figure out exactly where the LEAP funds were reverted at the end of fiscal year 2023. At the current moment, there's some discrepancy as to whether or not they were reverted to the DPA or potentially to the general fund. So we're working that through with MSDE. On the remaining 7 items, one of the projects for the Maryland New Start program was inadvertently reverted to the general fund by the Department of Commerce. We are recommending that for the projects, the money stay with the agency or be reappropriated to the agency. And we believe that the funds for the Center for Neuroscience and the Baltimore Regional Integrated Crisis, which just reflects small balances, be able to revert to the general fund.
Should we mention all this?
Oh, yes. And in the original Budget Reconciliation Act, there was a provision to revert $355,000 that was included inadvertently in the Budget Reconciliation Act, and the administration will be proposing an amendment to remove that reversion.
Any questions, Secretary or Mr. Nicole? Delegate Evenson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Great to see you both. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask you specifically about the $100 million in transportation funding that was added to the dedicated purpose account a year ago. In the analysis on page 12, it says that the funds were restricted pending a report from MDOT. That report has been submitted and a budget amendment to transfer the funds is imminent. Could you tell us a sense of what imminent means, but if you wouldn't mind a preview for us, where that money is going to go?
Yeah, I don't know the status of that.
Okay. We may need to
Yeah,
get back to you on the
sure.
specific status of the budget amendment. We can't remember if it's in legislature's hands yet for review or if it's still with us, but it is definitely in process. And my recollection is that the funds are targeted to support planning on the Red Line project in Baltimore City.
Great, thanks so much.
Assume we'll see it soon in either case, so. Okay. Any other questions on dedicated purpose or other state reserve funds? Okay, why don't you all stay there because you're gonna be back up in just a minute, so you're welcome to stay at the table. Gonna move on to the next part of our agenda, which is payments to civil divisions. Yasho Rai is with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and the members of the committee. My name is Yashodhara Rai, and I'll be presenting the analysis for payments to civil divisions of the state. This portion of the budget is comprised of 3 items: disparity grants to low wealth jurisdictions based on a formula set in statute, grants to mitigate the impact of the local assumption of a portion of teacher retirement cost. These amounts are set in statute, and gaming grants to Calvert County. As shown here on page 1, the fiscal 25 budget decreases by $41.9 million, of which $31.6 million decrease accounts for the disparity grant. Turning to page 2, the fiscal 24 working appropriation added 2 appropriations to miscellaneous grants, $10 million in general fund to Baltimore City and $250,000 in general fund to Kent County to increase the local contribution to Baltimore City Public Schools and Kent County Public Schools respectively above the fiscal 23 contribution. All these amounts have been fully distributed. Exhibit 1 on page 3 shows each county's various grant amounts in fiscal 25 allowance. The first column is the disparity grant, and the second is the amount provided to local school boards to supplement their assumption of a portion of teachers' retirement costs. Exhibit 2 on page 4 shows the proposed budget change. Prince George's County receives the largest decrease in disparity grants by $29.2 million. The changes are formula driven. Prince George's County has seen a population decline while tax revenues have remained stable in tax year 2022. This leads to an increased per capita tax yield, which lowers the per capita grant amount and eventually reduces the grant amount for the county. Cecil County's disparity grant decreases by $1.1 million due to the county's change in local income tax rate from 2.8% to 2.75%. This resulted in no disparity grant allocation for the county in fiscal 25. The miscellaneous grants decreased by $10.25 million due to the one-time addition in fiscal 24 working appropriation for Baltimore City Public Schools and Kent County Public Schools. Turning to page 5, the disparity grants are state funding targeted at the difference in counties' abilities in raising revenue from their local income tax. Counties with per capita local tax revenues less than 75% of the statewide per capita local tax revenue are eligible for grants in the amount of the difference between their revenue and 75% of the statewide average. There is a soft cap on the grant based on the county's 2010 grant amount and the county's tax rate. The cap can be increased based on the county's income tax rate. Exhibit 3 on page 6 shows the disparity grant calculation under the current law for fiscal 25. The tax rates for Anne Arundel County and Frederick County are noted various because they adopted graduate income tax brackets starting calendar year 2023, which is discussed in pages 7 through 9 of this analysis. Turning to page 7, Chapter 23 of the 2021 special session requires all local governments to impose a minimum tax rate of 2.25% and a rate up to 3.2%. It also authorizes the local governments to impose county income tax on a bracket basis who must set the income tax brackets that apply to each income tax rate by ordinance or resolution, and also notify the comptroller of a rate or income tax bracket change by July 1st prior to the year in which a new bracket is established. Since the enactment of Chapter 23, Anne Arundel and Frederick counties have adopted bracket-based income tax rates beginning tax year 23. Exhibit 4 on page 7 shows the bracket-based income tax rates for these two counties beginning tax year 23. It ranges from 2.7% to 2.81% for Anne Arundel County and from 2.75% to 2.96% for Frederick County. Starting tax year 24, these two counties modified their income tax brackets to incorporate a 3.2% income tax rate for high earners. Exhibit 5 on page 8 shows the modified income tax rate brackets based on an individual's tax filing status. This adoption of graduated income tax rates beginning tax year 23 does not impact the fiscal 25 allowance disparity grant calculation because the fiscal 25 allowance is based on tax year 22 net income tax amount. However, they will begin impacting the fiscal 26 allowance grant calculation as the calculation is based on tax year 23 income tax amount when the graduated income tax rates were adopted. This complicates the determination of a jurisdiction's per capita tax yield, which is based on a jurisdiction's income tax revenues and its population in that particular tax year. While there is a cap on the grant set at the county's fiscal 2010 grant amount, there's also a provision that if an eligible county's grant amount determined by the formula is higher than the county's maximum grant amount, the county is provided a portion of the uncapped amount. Due to the adoption of this graduated income tax rates, this portion of the uncapped amount may vary, resulting in differing grant amounts. We request the agency to comment on how it will address the challenges associated with calculating the formula beginning fiscal 26 while working with the Office of the Comptroller to obtain the data needed. Page 10 is DLS's recommended action to adopt a committee narrative requesting a report from DBM and the Office of the Comptroller on the impact of the adoption of new income tax bracket rates by jurisdictions on the disparity grant calculation and a plan for how DBM will calculate the disparity grant amounts starting with the fiscal 26 allowance. This is the end of my presentation and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ryan. I think that was your first full committee presentation. Excellent job. Welcome. Any questions for our analyst? Okay, Madam Secretary, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Helene Grady, Secretary of Budget and Management. We appreciate the thorough analysis prepared by Ms. Rye, and congratulations on your first. With regard to the one recommendation from DLS, that the Department of Budget and Management should comment on how we will address the challenges associated with calculating the disparity grant formula beginning in fiscal 26, and recommends adopting committee narrative requesting a report from DBM and the Office of the Comptroller on the impact of the adoption of the new income tax bracket rates by jurisdictions on the disparity grant calculation, and a plan for how we will calculate disparity grant amounts starting with the 26 allowance. DBM acknowledges these challenges that the adoption of the graduated income taxes at the local level could create for the calculation of the disparity formula. I want to say upfront that we do not expect any problems for fiscal 2026 given the current county income tax rate structures, but we do concur with the recommendation to work with the Office of the Comptroller on the requested report.
Questions for the Secretary, Delegate Rice?
I guess the challenge is just looking at this chart, Exhibit 3. There's a lot of counties that are getting a cut to their disparity grant. I think there's only 2 that's actually getting an increase, if I'm looking at this correctly. And so the challenges for our local governing bodies, as it is for the state, anything that's that volatile, it creates a huge challenge, especially given the fact if they're getting these cuts, they also have the challenge of funding Blueprint as well. Is I guess based on DLS's recommendations to you all, could you guys also figure out a possible way that we can somehow smooth this volatility down to make it I guess, less painful for our local governing bodies, potentially to be able to budget and be able to find that money, because, you know, I'm just looking at some of these, but I can't speak for Prince George's County, and that's a huge cut, to them. And even though they have a declining population, and I would imagine that their expenses aren't going to go down to run county government. And you know, for Caroline, it's only, I say only $615,000. But for a county, you know, with only 30,000 people and I think about a $50 million budget, that's a huge cut. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that's something that you guys might be able to work on and possibly report back to us.
I definitely appreciate the point you're making, and having spent time in local government, I can understand the pressure that the volatility causes. I think what I would just point out is, to the extent, obviously we all know, to the extent disparity grant awards are going down, that's an indicator that that particular county's relative wealth relative to the rest of the state is likely increasing, at least on a per capita basis. That's definitely the example with Prince George's County this year, which is the largest decrease. But I take your point, and if we're going to be studying changes to the methodology because of the income tax rate structures, we can certainly also take a look at whether there are ways to smooth the volatility. I think it's an annual calculation, Mark is telling me, trying to remember. So we could look at, you know, whether a 3-year rolling average into some of these numbers might make sense.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. Delegate Anderson.
Hey, thanks for coming today on this happy Friday. Yep, happy Friday. Back to the disparity grants. I mean, this is a big issue for us in Wycomico County, and as well as everyone else. And I'm just curious if there's a way offline, you could provide me with a breakdown of why the numbers change for each county. I'm just
Yep.
curious.
We actually have that.
Right.
We provided it to one of your Senate colleagues the other day.
Yeah,
Just sent
so
it
I'd
along.
like to know, you know, like in particular, like with, you know, Wycomico's down 2 million, but then Allegheny's up 1.7 million. Just doesn't kind of jive with me.
We can speak to the Comico numbers now if it's helpful, but we're also happy to forward the detail.
Sure.
You can speak to it now, but please do forward it to the committee, secretary, and we'll disseminate it to all the members.
We'll absolutely do that, Mr. Chairman. Delegate, we had received information from the Comptroller's Office on income tax wealth used for calculation of the formula. And the formula is about wealth and about population. And I don't know how the population changed.
We've grown.
But when you looked at statewide wealth for tax year 2022 over 2021, there was an actually decline in statewide wealth. There was a decline of 0.3%. Wycomico County, on the other hand, experienced a 5.9% increase in wealth. So relative, as the secretary said before, this is a relative wealth calculation. So Wycomico did much better than the statewide average, and so the grant amount went down. But we will absolutely share all the detailed numbers.
That's good. Well, if that's the case and we're growing, then you have to celebrate that. But I don't think we're seeing it yet, but hopefully it shows up. So thanks.
Yeah, that's right. Any other questions? All right. Nice to see you both. Have a good weekend.
Thanks,
Thank
you
you.
too.
You too.
Committee, you all have a good weekend too. We're adjourned.